Good evening and welcome to the Poets Cafe. I am William R. Kraft Jr., your host this evening, and we are very honored this evening to have David Lehman, who is a part-time resident of Ithaca, a critically acclaimed poet. He's the series editor for the Best American Poetry Anthology. Good evening, Mr. Lehman. It's nice to have you here.
Thank you for having me here.
Well, I'd like to start off by asking what new projects you're working on right now.
I'm always working on more projects than one, and Valentine Place, a new book of my poems, is coming out in a matter of weeks.
Yeah.
It's named after the street I live in Ithaca.
Yeah.
And I'm writing new poems in a somewhat different vein. And I'm also working on a book about the New York School of Poets, nonfiction critical work. And also I'm putting to bed Best American Poetry 1996 and beginning reading on the 1997 volume. It's always something to do.
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, we all know Valentine Place is a small street off of East State. Is there anything else, that, what's the main reason the book is entitled Valentine Place? Is it just because, it's named after the street? Or what is the case there?
Actually, the poems are almost obsessively about love, romance, sex, divorce, heartbreak, the whole gamut of emotions surrounding the pursuit of happiness in America. And it was sort of serendipitous that I was living on a street called Valentine Place, which seems to name the very central concerns of my poetry.
Yeah.
And yet it took me a couple of years before I used that title.
Yeah.
As though one is blind to what is in front of one.
Yeah.
But there's that obvious double reason for invoking that title, the street you live in and the very subject of the book. Yeah,
well, I as well know that, as I mentioned earlier, you work on the Best American Poetry series. How did you get started with this project way back in 1988, I believe?
Yes. Actually, the day I moved into the house I bought in Valentine Place was the last day of July of 1987. The day after, I drove back to Ludlowville, where I used to live, to pick up some house plants and a few odds and ends, and I had the idea driving for an annual anthology devoted to the best of the year's poetry.
Yeah.
I don't know why it hit me at that moment, maybe because you feel this clean space when you moved your belongings and packed them all up and threw out things. But it occurred to me that there wasn't such a book, even though there were annual anthologies devoted to the best fiction of the year, and even one devoted to the best essays of the year. And I suppose the assumption was either that the book wouldn't sell, or that American poetry is so factionalized that you couldn't house it all under one roof. But I felt that you could.
Yeah, that was one thing I was curious about. What exactly goes into the process of selecting what is the best American poetry?
Well, my assumption in running the series is that two heads are better than one.
Yeah.
And that it's good to have a constant. That's me, who's there every year, who knows what's happened in each previous year, and to work with another person, a distinguished poet, as a guest editor. That person makes the final selections, and I help by screening poems, picking poems for her or him to look at. And so both of us are reading constantly, and we're always hoping to be knocked out by somebody new or somebody old who's turning a new leaf.
What sources do you just use, like magazines, or what sources do you use to select this poetry?
Magazines. I just did a count the other day. I believe we had 108 different magazines provide us with at least one poem in the last 3 editions of Best American Poetry. It averages out that there are something like 40 to 50 magazines each year providing poems. Some of the magazines are very well known, like the New Yorker or the Atlantic or the venerable Poetry Magazine or Tri-Quarterly or Epic here at Cornell. But there are also magazines that no one has ever heard of that just sort of turn up, like Exquisite Corpse, or Urbanus, or Farmer's Market.
Yeah. In the forward, I've noticed, because I've read the last three, the four of the last three, and you give more or less what someone might call a state-of-the-art form address about poetry. What is your feeling about right now about the health of American poetry?
Well, I feel mixed. I think that on the one hand, American poetry is tremendously vital from the point of view of how much good poetry is being written by how many poets. How many poets seem to be writing their best poetry. I think Ashbery is still at his peak. I think Strand and Merwin and Louise Glick and Archie Ammons, there's a list of poets writing at the top of their form. And it's a deep list, and there are people who are just in their 40s and 50s who are sort of breaking through. So from the point of view of the wealth, abundance of poetry, I think it's a very, very healthy situation. I think our poetry today compares favorably to that of any period in American history, and I think furthermore that American poetry today is or should be the envy of the English-speaking world. I said before that my feelings are mixed, and the mixed part is that poetry doesn't get nearly as much attention and respect as I think would be healthy. I wrote about this in the foreword to Best American Poetry in 1995, that for poetry to flourish, you need a conception of fame, a conception of immortality, of posterity, of the ages. And I think in our culture we have, famously reduced the attention span, and the Andy Warhol definition of fame as taking place in a 15-minute increment is very harmful to the creation of lasting art. And I think that there are some circumstances that are inimical to the writing of poetry.
But my personal impression is poetry as an art form is growing, right? And I've noticed that sometimes, well, in a couple times in particular, you have criticized like the poetry slams and poetry, like that appears on MTV and things like this. Isn't it better, even if it is not, the poetry's not so good, for poetry just to be seen and not heard?
That argument is made a lot, and I'll go along with it. And though I have criticized some of the poetry produced for such circumstances, I've actually participated in poetry slams, 3 or 4 of them. And Bob Holman, who runs the Nuyorican Cafe, is a friend of mine. We were classmates at Columbia many years ago, and he just sent me his new book, and it's very lively. And we're going to do a Best American Poetry slam in April, I think. I think I'm supposed to be the quiz master of the Name That Line segment. And I'm all for it. I think it's wonderful to have poetry in unusual venues in different places. I don't think we should blinker ourselves to some of the less positive aspects of such an experience. But I'm not against it at all. I think it's very healthy that we have so many people who write poetry. And I think it's good that there's a new development that makes poetry sexy for younger people in their 20s, to realize that this is a vital living art form and not something fossilized for professors to ponder.
You wrote in the foreword of the Best American Poetry of 1994 that harm can come from turning poetry into an instrument for social change. If this is true, what is the true purpose of poetry? Because I personally believe that is one of the main purposes of poetry sometimes.
You think one of the main purposes of poetry is to effect social change?
Yes, I do.
I think this is a question that's been debated not only for 100 years, but for 2,000 years. What is the purpose of poetry? And one answer, the answer that Tolstoy favored, is the answer that you endorse as well. And there's an argument to be made for that. I see also, however, how putting poetry to the service of political ends can produce bad poetry.
Yeah.
And that's something I think we should keep in mind, that there's a difference between poetry and propaganda. It's all very well for people to express their feelings, but it doesn't necessarily produce good poetry any more than the unconscious and dreams automatically produce good poetry.
So it's more the quality that really concerns you, because it sounds, because before you mentioned about this new poetry, because I read that you said that once you wrote that the quality level was dismal, and is it just that you're worried about having good poetry? Is that more of a concern than
I think I'm an
general?
aesthete, and I, am sort of not going to be able to change very much from being the kind of reader who wants poetry to be of the highest possible quality. I'm sort of spoiled by Keats, by Yeats. And so my first impulse in reading a poem is to see if it speaks to me, if it's fresh and new and original and grabs me. And I can well see that there might be people whose first standard in reading a poem would have to do with whether that poem aspires to better the lot of mankind. That's not my point of view, in part because I've seen the harmful effects of a political program. There's very little really good political poetry, and very little poetry that's also made very real changes in the political world. That isn't to say that it can't be done, and we can think of exceptions.
Now, I find that poetry is a slow discovery towards an elusive goal that never's quite in our grasp. That's my personal impression of poetry. How would you best define poetry?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. And it relates to the last question you asked, which is, what is the purpose of poetry? I think the first obligation of the poet is to keep poetry alive. This begs your question, but before the poet is to change the world, the poet has to keep alive the flickering flames and embers of poetry, which are always in danger of being snuffed out in a society that is materialistic and anti-intellectual. Our society is. Most of the societies in the world today are antagonistic in some way to poetry, yet people need poetry as much as they need bread. People die for the want of poetry. Poetry has something to do with beauty, I think. I feel that very strongly. You may feel that poetry has more to do with justice. I feel that poetry has a great deal to do with beauty, and poetry has a great deal to do with the language and the vitality of our language that we speak. And I think poetry has to do with the soul, too. I think poetry has been put under tremendous burden in the 20th century, because when the century began, poetry had to replace, for many people, what religion was. Religion was a dying thing for the intellectuals. And then as the century wore on and people grew disenchanted with the various ideological gods that failed, Marxism or the horrors of fascism, poetry and the other arts began to have to substitute for politics. Well, this is a burden that no art can bear very easily, for poetry to be religion and politics as well as itself. That's a tall order. If we use that standard, would Keats's odes be great poetry? Did they change the world? Did they improve anyone's lot? Yet we love them. We love them because they're beautiful, they touch us, and they keep alive the idea of the human soul in all of its aspirations, in all its capacity. I think that's why we love Keats.
Well, I haven't even covered half the questions I prepared for you, but but it's already time for us to close this segment of the program. In a moment, we'll be right back with a poetry reading. David Lehman is going to be reading from his new book, Valentine Place. And we're going to have a calendar of upcoming events in the local area, so stay tuned.
My name is David Lehman, and I'm reading some poems from my new book, which is called Valentine Place. One of the first poems in the book is called The Choice. He had to choose. He could fight the Vietnam War in a helicopter rescuing diplomats from Saigon in his dreams, or in the icy silence of the tomb he and his wife had been living in since April. Or he could refuse in favor of a love affair with a woman who swam the English Channel using 2 strokes. She had high cheekbones and jet black hair, or maybe it was foxy eyes and a mop of brown curls. Anyway, she had infiltrated his dreams. He lowered his voice. War and peace may be great themes, he said, but adultery is even greater. It was their last conversation in bed. You're going to miss me, she said. Kiss me, he heard, and the prediction began to come true with her voice still in his ear. Sometimes what you thought was an interruption turns out to be your life, and sometimes what you thought was your life turns out to have been an interruption, and yet you have to act as if you were back in the 4th grade and knew the right answer was Pittsburgh, but put down Bethlehem just to see what would happen, how it would feel to be wrong. The next poem I'd like to read is called The Drowning. My mother told me the story, and I believed it, about the boy who went out too far, beyond the voices of older sister and smarter brother, exhausted father smoking a cigar and reading the paper, distracted mother changing the baby's diaper. He left them behind and walked into the sea and vanished in the foam and never came back. And I promised that I wouldn't do what he did, but I wanted to know more about him and vowed to bring him back to life, and my mother laughed. And I am still that boy standing on the shore, alone, abandoned by his grown-up brother, or stranded with the woman that he married and their ill-tempered brood, with sand in their hair. As the waves advance, the spray hits the air like snow falling upwards, and nothing will bring him back, the red-haired boy who commanded the waves with a conductor's wand before he disappeared in the sea, in the story my mother told so well that even though she made it up, I was sure it had happened to me. I wrote a poem in the aftermath of the bombing of the World Trade Center back in 1993. It's called The World Trade Center. I never liked the World Trade Center. When it went up, I talked it down, as did many other New Yorkers. The Twin Towers were ugly monoliths that lacked the details, the ornament, the character of the Empire State Building, and especially the Chrysler Building, everyone's favorite, with its scalloped top so noble. The World Trade Center was an example of what was wrong with American architecture, and it stayed that way for 25 years until that Friday afternoon in February when the bomb went off and the buildings became a great symbol of America, like the Statue of Liberty at the end of Hitchcock's Saboteur. My whole attitude toward the World Trade Center changed overnight. I began to like the way it comes into view as you reach 6th Avenue from any side street, the way the tops of the towers dissolve into white skies in the east when you cross the Hudson into the city across the George Washington Bridge. I wrote a whole sequence of poems called Valentine Place. It's the title sequence of the book Valentine Place. It's going to come out soon. And the sequence begins with a poem called First Lines, and then there's Second Thoughts, Third Act, Fourth Estate, Fifth Amendment. I'll read sixth sentence.
Something told him she was near, in the same room even, wearing the blue polka dot dress he'd given her, with the pearl choker and the sapphire earrings, holding a Kir Royale. He looked at her left hand, no ring, and knew he had to get out of there, fast, before one of them did something irrevocable, like the time she slapped his face in the bus, and he wasn't sure why, or the day they stood in front of the dress shop window, and when she said she liked the yellow kimono, he went and bought it on the spot. What an amazing day that was. Everyone he met that day was someone he had known before, a decade ago or more, and the statue of Alice, the gigantic girl in Central Park, turned out to be his sister when they were small. Mama was in the kitchen, waiting for the phone to ring, and Daddy was still on the road, checking the rear view mirror in the old green Chevrolet when the hurricane hit. One of the other men drowned that night, but Daddy came back safely with gifts for all the kids if they agreed to go to sleep and dream of him. Well, in the same sequence of poems, Valentine Place, here is Ninth Inning. He woke up in New York City on Valentine's Day, speeding. The body in the booth next to his was still warm, was gone. He had bought her a sweater, a box of chocolate, said her life wasn't working. He looked stricken. She said, "You're all bent out of shape," accusingly. And when she went from being an Ivy League professor of French to an illustrator for a slick Midtown magazine, they agreed it was his fall. But for now, they needed to sharpen to a point, like a pencil, the way the Empire State Building does. What I really want to say to you, my love, is a whisper on the rooftop, lost in the wind, and you turn to me with your rally cap on backwards, rooting for a big inning, the bases loaded, our best slugger up, and no one out. But it doesn't work that way. Like the time Kirk Gibson hit the homer off Dennis Eckersley to win the game. It doesn't happen like that in fiction. In fiction, we are on a train, listening to a storyteller about to reach the climax of his tale as the train pulls into Minsk, his stop. "That's my stop," he says, stepping off the train, confounding us who can't get off it. "You can't leave without telling us the end," we say, but he is already on the platform, grinning. "End?" he says. "It was only the beginning." I think I have time for one more poem, a short poem, the last poem in the book. It's called Dutch Interior. Well, perhaps I have time for two poems. The last poem in the book and one other. Well, this poem is called Flashback. The lonely boy in the blue snowsuit playing with the dog that didn't exist in the yard of the house that hadn't yet been built was the older brother I never had, and he was carving a snow palace guarded by soldiers and stone lions where violins played waltzes from the Vienna woods, while in the big bay window in the living room you could see the mouths of his parents moving, and though you couldn't hear the words, you knew a divorce was in the cards. And then you see a close-up of the mother's face, and suddenly you can tell what she will look like in 20 years and what she looked like 20 years ago. The boy vanishes. It continues to snow. This one is called On the Run. "Too late," said Uncle Alvin, checking his watch. He was supposed to take the boy to the funeral, little suspecting it would be his own. Too late, the killing words. "But my friend, we have come too late," said the hero. The textbook salesman in the motel room can hear the words echo in his ear and wonders what they mean in his case. Has he left something undone? Neglected someone he should have loved? More than likely. Yet even at 28, years before the age of regret, He had already heard the words. It was too late to assemble the birds as he had pictured them one spring morning. Too late to marry the girl and sire numerous offspring in bohemian splendor. Too late for anything but life on the run, life as he was living it, in motels and rental cars, running away from something, though not sure what, running in place to keep up with the others, in pursuit of the ring rolling down the street, or to escape into the glory of an unknown destiny, running into enemy territory as fast as a boy. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to read these poems from Valentine Place.
Well, I'd like to take this opportunity to say good night to everyone out there who's been watching, and I'd like to thank David Lehman one last time for joining us this evening. And remember to tune in next Friday at 8 when our special guest is going to be Rick Thompson. Thank you very much, and good evening.